Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us in this remarkable gathering. I'm Juju Chang. I am the co-anchor of ABC News Nightline, and I have the honor of serving as your moderator today. This event is hosted by the Committee of 100. C100 is, as you may know, the nonpartisan leadership organization of prominent Chinese Americans across business and government, academia, and the arts. And of course, they were kind enough to invite a Korean American. So we're starting with solidarity right there. Our discussion today centers on the recent rise in anti-Asian hate and violence, as well as the calls for unity and racial solidarity in the wake of the mass shooting at 3 Asian-themed spas in Atlanta, along with the well-documented surge of attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders across the country for the past year. With more than 21 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, AAPI as we refer to them, living in the United States, the message today should be loud and clear that our community is not alone in the fight against prejudice and scapegoating, and that together we will rise. United in that same spirit and in that mission, we've brought together leaders from C100 and the ADL and the NAACP, as well as the US Senate and the House of Representatives. It's quite a gathering. We're going to share concerns and experiences and perhaps even lay out a roadmap for the future and how we move forward together. So let's start, and perhaps we can end by collectively calling for change. With some brief introductions, we'll dive right in afterwards. Joining us tonight is Jonathan Greenblatt. He's the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Its Center on Extremism has done remarkable work, and the group is a thought leader in tracking hate groups. Gary Locke is chairman-elect of C100, a former governor of the state of Washington. He served as U.S. ambassador to China, as we may know. Derrick Johnson is president and CEO of the NAACP and has been on the forefront of the national conversation around racial equity in the years since George Floyd's death. The Honorable Alex Padilla is a U.S. Senator from the great state of California, and I can say that having grown up in Silicon Valley. He's serving now after Kamala Harris vacated her seat. We know why. Senator Padilla also distinguished himself as the first Latino Secretary of State in California. And finally, the Honorable Grace Meng, Congresswoman from the great borough of Queens, and I can say that as a decades-long New Yorker, the first and only Asian American in Congress from New York. And I wonder how many first and onlys there are represented on this panel tonight. But Ambassador Locke, let me begin with you and have you set the stage for us with a simple question, which is, how did we get here? I mean, connect the dots for us, if you will, from the pandemic and the xenophobia that was directed and some say weaponized against the AAPI community, and then the dramatic increases that we began to see in hate crimes. Ambassador Locke, I think you're muted.
That's the new normal, right? You're muted. But thanks, Juju, for moderating this. And I am just so honored to be a part of this incredible panel with Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League and Derrick Johnson of the NAACP, and of course, our two great members of the Congress, Senator Padilla and Congresswoman Meng. So this issue has really been in existence for quite some time. I mean, the manifestation has been long in the making and actually going over 100 years, from the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s to the alien land laws that prohibited Asians, primarily Asians, from owning land in the United States. And many of these laws were not repealed until the 1950s. The Asian Exclusion Act, which kept Chinese from coming to the United States, was not repealed until the middle of World War II. And of course, Mr. Greenblatt and Mr. Johnson can document all the cases of racism throughout our entire country. What's really exacerbated the situation, especially for Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, is the tone and the rhetoric coming from the top government officials in Washington, D.C., when you call it the Kung Flu virus, the China virus, the Wuhan virus, in a mocking way. And certainly China needs to be held to account for the lack of transparency in revealing to the world the COVID virus, COVID-19. But that does not excuse government leaders from mocking people of Asian ancestry, and especially Chinese ancestry. because when you add to that the various initiatives coming from the administration, the Trump administration, really portraying all Chinese Americans and people of Chinese ancestry as spies, as being loyal to Beijing and not being true Americans. Even companies founded by US citizens of Chinese ancestry, very notable American companies, that everything somehow is suspect. That filters down. And so then people want to cast blame. And this exposure of people's darkness, of the division, of racism, of discrimination, of scapegoating, always wanting to try and find someone to blame, someone to cause, means it came out. So first it was, the Kung flu virus, the China virus. Then it was vandalism of restaurants and establishments and graffiti. And then it became violent, as we saw. But this is something that America has been dealing with and has laid bare with the killing of George Floyd. And that's why all of us organizations, civil rights organizations, have to join together to stamp out constantly, be vigilant against racism and discrimination and scapegoating, because it's a disease that, if allowed to spread, affects everybody. And so that's what we really need to focus on.
Absolutely. Congresswoman Meng, let me bring you in. You introduced the COVID Hate Crimes Act. When I did a story featuring you, you played for me racist voicemails that you received during the past year. Give us an overview, if you will, of what you saw playing out in DC and why you think racial solidarity is such an important part of the solution moving forward.
Well, first, I also want to thank you, Juju, for moderating and for the tremendous work that you've put in to talking about this issue throughout the last year, really, across the country. Love being with Ambassador Locke, Senator Padilla, and I really want to give a special shout out to ADL and the NAACP. Last year when the Asian American community was warning against using phrases like Kung flu and Chinese virus, we put up a resolution that condemned bigotry towards Asian Americans that was passed by Congress. And this wasn't a resolution that was only supported by Asian Americans. ADL and the NAACP were amongst the first two groups in the entire country very early on that stood publicly with the Asian American community, condemning racism towards anyone, including Asian Americans. So I'm so incredibly thankful for the solidarity and the allyship that has been shown. Last year, we passed a symbolic resolution. This year, we are working with Senator Hirono in the Senate on legislation that would do a couple of things. It would provide resources for our community organizations. We have seen so many of our local groups literally on the front lines of dealing with and helping members of the Asian American community. It would provide dedicated personnel at the Department of Justice. What we've seen, depending on where cases have happened throughout the country, that each state sort of has its own process. Some have stronger amount of resources to help law enforcement investigate these types of incidents, some of which are hate crimes, and some don't have a lot of resources. And so we want a more unified and centralized system. Also to provide easier ways for victims to report these incidents in multiple languages, maybe online, just to figure out ways so it's easier. We always tell people, just go report it. That's a lot easier said than done. It's not always easy for people to report it. People might not feel comfortable walking into a police precinct that they've never been to. People might have language obstacles. People might literally, as someone told me, when someone shouted, racial slurs against her, she was on her way to work. She didn't have time to, sit there and wait for a police officer to help her file these reports. And lastly, I will say that counseling and education is important. I'm going to say something that might not always be popular, but that we are not going to hate crime our way out of this problem. This is a problem that is complicated, and the solution will not be straightforward. Even if we were to charge and prosecute every single attacker, with a hate crime, it's not going to solve the problem. There are mental health investments that we need to have larger conversations about. And there is just a longer term issue of education and making sure that we're doing everything we can to break down in the long term the walls of biases and stereotypes. And that's just part of it. But we are excited. We were at a press conference with Senator Schumer, Speaker Pelosi, and Senator Hirono today to talk about this legislation, and we are hopeful to have bipartisan support this week for passage in the Senate.
That was very comprehensive. Thank you, Congresswoman. Let me turn to you, Senator Padilla. I know Grace touched on some of the difficulties in the immigrant community. Not only might there be linguistic barriers, there may be undocumented status reasons why people don't want to report crimes. The immigrant community is something that our community and the Latinx community shares. I'd be curious what you're seeing in the Senate on the No Hate Act, for example, that is a broader look at trying to make tallying and reporting some of these hate crimes more accessible, and what perhaps you've seen, not just in DC, but in the state that you represent, which has such a vibrant and large AAPI population.
Right. Well, thank you, Juju, and thank you to, frankly, all the panelists and presenters today for this important and sadly timely conversation. Your question brings to mind a two-part answer. Number one, if we're going to try to, whether it's education or even mental health that Representative Meng just talked about, and by the way, she's been powerful and articulate in addressing these issues of late in Congress. A lot of policy is best informed with data and with facts. And so the dynamic of underreporting for a variety of reasons at times doesn't help us be as firm, as strategic, as focused in policy making as we need to be. And so again, when these incidents happen, it's important that we encourage people to report them to authorities as best we can. And it's frankly a collective standing up and speaking out that gives people the license to be able to come forward. There are many reasons why people may not want to report their crime, whether they're running out of time, as Representative Meng mentioned, if you're on the way to work, whether there's a linguistic or a cultural barrier. That is very real, particularly in diverse communities. And you're right, for maybe somebody's undocumented, even legal immigrants, people who are here legally, for risk of, if something goes wrong, I don't want to undermine my eventual opportunity to become a citizen, and so maybe I'll just let this one slide. That is not only not helpful, it is hurtful when it comes to rooting out the issues and the concerns. You're talking about what's happening in the Senate, how is this being received. To think that this is something that may be a casualty of the filibuster. Are you kidding me? We may not be able to get 60 votes for something as fundamental as acknowledging everybody's civil rights and the right to be able to live free of fear of hate crimes is unconscionable. And so we're working through that to see if what we need to do to get all of our colleagues on both Democrat and Republican comfortable with the fundamental value statement that the resolutions and the legislation we're putting forward stand for and represent. And last but not least, let me just say what an opportunity and responsibility we have as federal officials under this new administration. Thankfully, a very different tone than the prior administration, to have conversations with people like Attorney General Garland now, let alone FBI Director Wray, to say, how can we bring the power and resources of the federal government to bear to prioritize and address hate crimes, root out white supremacy in all its forms, in all its places, etc. We have a lot of work to do, but it begins with dialogue like this and leaders, elected and otherwise, standing up and speaking up together.
I want to bring in Derrick Johnson. Derrick, I just read your statement that you released after the mass shooting in Atlanta, and you referenced extremism, domestic extremism, and the need for solidarity. A very eloquent statement. Of course, I can't find it in my notes now, but we'll leave it at that. The point being that, you know, the NAACP has been engaged in an historic struggle against systemic racism and discrimination. What lessons do you think, and what inspiration do you think the AAPI community can draw from your lessons? And what is the best way forward in dealing with some of these extremist groups that you referenced?
Well, thank you, Juju. I want to thank Committee 100, not only for convening this conversation, but for reaching out last year. I have this statement, be a friend before you need a friend. Because if you're not a friend when you need one, there will be no one there. And what you exemplified last year in response to COVID and just simply reaching out to build a relationship, you know, you were being a friend before you needed a friend. And in this moment, we all need friends, because what we have witnessed over the last 4 years was the bully pulpit of the White House being used to embolden a sense of white supremacist dogma that has paralyzed much of what we do in terms of public policy, that has enabled individuals to come out of the darkness and to march in Charlottesville, to created terrorists to go to synagogues in Pittsburgh, or go to the Latino community in Texas, or feel so encouraged by their wrongness to go to the US Capitol and commit treason. And what we must do as a global community in the United States is stand in solidarity. The caste system that we have in this country is going to destroy us if we don't destroy it. And that is something that's really evident for the NAACP as the oldest civil rights organization at 112 years old. Internal to the Black community, we're a very diverse community. But when it comes to addressing white supremacist dogma and behavior, we recognize no matter what our backgrounds are, what country of origins, what region of this country we come from, we must unite. And that is the #1 lesson for the Asian community. You must unite and not accept the concept of a caste system and we impose it internal to our community. Secondly, being a friend before you need a friend is always important, because as things evolve, we must stand up. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, that wasn't just to act for African Americans to get access to vote. It also was covered jurisdictions in San Francisco because of the long-standing exclusion from Asian Americans in San Francisco from being able to fully participate, and in New York. It also, in the backdrop of Hurricane Katrina, when we've seen the devastation in New Orleans, what was not recognized was the Vietnam community who live along the Gulf of Mexico from New Orleans all the way across to Mobile, who was also impacted. We must stand together when we see the attacks on a social contract we call DACA, where one administration give a clear pathway for communities to really become full citizens as they are already contributing. We as NAACP, we stood up, we fought the lawsuit. That lawsuit was merged with the state of California, and we successfully rolled back the reneging of that social contract, not because it was African Americans, but because anytime you have a nation that issues a social contract, we must force that honoring of that contract, because if we allow it to be reneged on one community, we can be assured it will be destroyed against all communities. Finally, you know, Jonathan and I, we have a road show. We show up twice a week having these conversations. Why? Because we both recognize very clearly what the past administration has done to our environment, our safety, our personal safety, as African American, as a Jewish American, and now as Asian Americans and Latino Americans, and we must stand united across our communities to ensure the atmosphere for white supremacist extremist activity is no longer accepted, and we stand united to fight against it.
It reminds me of Martin Luther King's quote that if there's injustice anywhere, it's a threat to justice everywhere. Well said, Derrick. And Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you quickly. As a Korean American, and as a Jewish American, my intersectionality is coming in handy today. I know that the ADL has been at the forefront of leading the battle against racism and xenophobia and hate. We touched on the importance of metrics in tallying these attacks. Why is it so vital to track hate groups and their activities and to understand the full scope and the impact of these groups?
Well, look, Juju, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I embrace the fact that, again, your intersectional identities come together. I think it's a reflection of the fact that America is an intersectional country. And so many of us have these overlapping identities as immigrants, as refugees, as Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Muslims, as African Americans, Asian Americans. I mean, the list goes on. It's such a rich tapestry, and it's what has always made this country so great. If I might, I'll just say that for starters, we describe ADL as the oldest anti-hate organization in the world. We were founded after a Jewish man was lynched in 1913. But when the ADL was founded, what the founders wrote in the charter, almost like a manifesto, they wrote that the purpose of ADL would be to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment to all. So this organization, for over a century, has been motivated by the simple idea that Jews in America are only safe when all minorities are safe. And only when everyone has justice do we as a Jewish people have justice. And so whether it was fighting for African Americans and civil rights starting in the 1940s to immigrants and to get the 1965 immigration law passed that started for us in the 50s to today when we stand in solidarity and with strength with our AAPI brothers and sisters, not only because we're a multiracial Jewish community, as you pointed out, Juju, but because an attack on a Chinese American is an attack on me as a Jewish American. We are all in this together. And this is encoded in the DNA of ADL, but it should be, in my opinion, encoded in the DNA of every American because it is e pluribus unum. Now, to do the work at ADL, to respond to the question, we deeply believe in an evidence-based approach. So we have been tracking anti-Semitic sentiment in the United States since the 1960s. We've been auditing hate incidents since the 1970s, since longer than the FBI. And our Center at Extremism literally has been tracking and fighting extremists since the 1930s, when we dealt with Nazi sympathizers in this country, or the KKK in the 50s, and today it's QAnon. But it's so important to ground this work because I will tell you this, Juju, and everyone should hear this. It doesn't matter how you vote at the ballot box. It matters what you value. And there is nothing political in calling out prejudice. Okay? There is nothing partisan in pushing for the dignity and equality of every American. And no one should be harassed, their homes vandalized, their loved ones, assaulted because of how they look or where they're from or how they pray. It is inexcusable in America in the year 2021. And so look, it's with humility and unfortunately, a lot of bruises ourselves, scars, that when we saw this starting to happen early last year, Juju, like in January, ADL is a bit of an early warning system. We started to see the hate, and it was started with the White House and it spread. And I remember, Grace, reaching out to you and or Congresswoman Meng, to you in your office. We started to become alarmed early last year. And unfortunately, it's gotten worse. But thankfully, again, groups like the Committee of 100 or Asian Americans Advancing Justice or so many other important community-based organizations and leaders like Congresswoman Meng, Governor Locke, Senator Padilla, and others are standing up and saying enough. So like, I'm honestly, it's a privilege for me to be able to share what we've learned to try to push back on this hate severely and squarely and put it back in the sewer where it belongs.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm going to go out of turn and go back to Senator Padilla because sadly he has to go to another engagement in a couple of minutes. He's out in California, as we know. And I wanted to follow up on Derrick's thoughts on the 1965 Voting Rights Act. In many ways, voting rights are at the center of the conversation. And it occurs to me that I am well familiar with the NAACP's sister organization, ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, and the work that they have been doing for decades on getting access to ballots and getting bilingual ballots and getting people registered. That it seems to me that as Secretary of State, former Secretary of State of the great state of California, that you had a lot to do with the transparency in the elections there, and what your thoughts are on how this might be an area where this coalition might be able to work together.
Yeah, no, look, I love the opportunity to talk about this because there's so much to say. But let's start with recognizing that voter suppression is rooted in white supremacy. Whether it was exclusion from the ballot box at the founding of the nation, all the way through the Jim Crow era, and sadly to this very day. I mean, I think we have great examples of what I'm proud of in California, where we maintain election integrity, but maximize access to the ballot and facilitate civic participation and voter participation. And then you have the counter examples, and we hear unto this day in Iowa and Georgia and Texas and elsewhere. So I think California has the playbook. What we can do to offer multiple opportunities and secure ways of registering to vote through traditional voter registration, automatic voter registration, same-day registration. So artificial deadlines don't become a barrier to participation. Multiple ways of casting your ballot, whether it's voting by mail, in-person voting, in-person early voting, just taking all the obstacles away while maintaining the integrity of the election. But then going above and beyond, recognizing the diversity of our population and the diversity of our electorate. The Federal Voting Rights Act does call for jurisdictions to offer materials, ballots, and otherwise in languages where there's a certain concentration or threshold of eligible voters who prefer a language other than English, whether it's their native language or for whatever reason. That's their choice. In California, we've taken a further step using demographers in our university system to look at more granular demographic data to make more languages eligible county by county for that additional voting information and ballot information. So it all goes back to the spirit, are we trying to be an inclusive democracy or not? And if we are, we have the best practices. Now it's just a matter of political will to expand across the country, what we've done in California. And I'm certainly hopeful to use my platform as now a United States Senator to advance it on a national basis.
Senator Padilla, thank you for your time. I know we're going to have to let you go, but I want to continue this conversation with everyone else. Derrick, talk to me about Georgia, because I know that this was an arena, certainly during this last Senate runoff, where the Asian American vote actually played a role. And that the mobilization that took place, we saw Andrew Yang campaigning down there, and that it looked almost like an Israeli parliamentary, runoff, because these little coalitions were being built together. How does what is happening in Georgia now moving forward and the restrictions, how does that sort of play out in your mind when it comes to voter mobilization?
Well, it's not just Georgia. There are over 40 states who are seeking to augment their election laws, chasing a problem that has not been verified to exist. Right now, we are gearing up for a fight in Texas. It is unfortunate, but it's the reality of power, that elected officials should not have the luxury of trying to pick their voters. Voters have the responsibility to pick the election officials. And that's what we're seeing playing out in Georgia, in Texas, even in Michigan, that the legislators are seeking to pass voting laws to suppress votes for the purpose of curbing future elections. And if the governor veto it, which she will do, then there's a whole signature campaign this is an exhausting exercise of futility, but something that we must fight. And what we're beginning to see, and it's a beautiful thing to see, is the Asian community stepping up in places like Houston and Harrison County. Harrison County made history by this last election cycle. And because it's such a fertile Asian community in Harrison County in Texas, which is Houston, they had an impact. You've seen it in Georgia with the coalitions that were being made. You see it in pockets of the Vietnamese community in New Orleans. It is a beautiful thing to see coalitions to come together to talk about the nature of governance, tax policy, and the role that the government should play in our communities. It is not acceptable to use government to malign communities, to suppress vote, and to shut out and maintain a caste system, particularly when you want to target communities like the Asian community, which we've seen that persistent attack 14 plus months by the former president, which opened up the door to the moment we're sitting in now with all of the violence towards the Asian community. It's not acceptable.
Gary, or Ambassador Locke, I should probably say, if I could bring you back into this conversation, I have been people from, the Council of Korean Americans, the UJA, AAJA, the alphabet soup of organizations have reached out to me and said, how can we be part of this conversation? And my answer is a question to you. And what does C100 and the NAACP and the ADL, these are large national organizations. How can they partner with some of these smaller grassroots organizations, with community organizations? And clearly the Asian American community suffers from the fact that we have so many different cultures and languages and political outlooks that it's very difficult to have a sort of galvanizing moment. But I wonder what your thoughts on what we as an Asian American community should be looking at. You're muted, sorry.
Always forgetting. We are in a galvanizing moment, and we need to take advantage of this to come together, not just within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, as you indicated, with all our different languages and subcultures and ethnic groups, but recognize that we are all under attack. And we need to encourage all the different organizations throughout America to rally and to contact their elected officials, their police departments, their prosecutors, and demand action, and to publicize not just the vilification and scapegoating against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, but all groups, and to educate the general public on the contributions that all groups have made to the United States. And that's why C100 is so proud to stand with the NAACP, the Anti-Defamation League, and so many other civil rights organizations all across the country. Because as both of our speakers indicated, and as you have indicated, injustice and bigotry against one is injustice and bigotry and racism against all. And I think we really need to come together and emphasize the fact that it's the diversity of our people that makes America great. That is what really makes America great. It's that diversity of people. Except for the Native Americans, the indigenous people, we're all foreigners. Whether we're first generation, 10th generation, whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower, a slave vessel from Africa, or a steamer from Asia, we're all foreigners. And it's that wave after wave of people from all parts of the world with different languages, cultures, perspectives, music, art, dance, religions, that has created this incredible vitality, this dynamism that is America. And it's that's a secret sauce of America. And we need to celebrate it. We need to celebrate the contributions of all these different ethnic groups all through the centuries that are here in America. And we need to tell our stories, whether it's the Chinese who built the railroad and completed the transcontinental railroad when it was stuck outside the mountains of California, and they had to turn to Chinese laborers with expertise in gunpowder and explosives and with great human cost to finish that railroad. to, Tuskegee Airmen. I mean, why is it that during World War II, you had African Americans serving in segregated units, defending and giving their lives for this country, Japanese Americans whose parents and elders were in barbed wire incarceration camps here in the United States, and yet they formed the most decorated unit in US military history. Native Americans who came from really impoverished, segregated, terrible conditions on Indian reservations. And the list goes on and on. Why were they fighting for a country that was treating them so terribly? Because they believed in the essential goodness of America and had hope for a better future. And that's what we need to, all our organizations need to focus on, telling the story of the contributions of the diversity of America. And so that's how I think we can all try to attack this.
Jonathan, I'd be curious, based on all of your expertise built over the decades, what do you think are the most effective tools to fight hate? One of the questions in our chat box is, does social media pressure platforms to prohibit the propagation of hate help messaging and fighting that kind of misinformation out there?
Juju, it's a great question, and I'm glad it was asked. And I think this is the reason why we're still in business, because hate is a hard problem to solve. And, I was very out in front in terms of the former president, whose use of racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia was casual and like congenital. And I think contributed a great deal to the situation we're in today. And yet hate existed before Donald Trump, and it will exist. We find it still exists after Donald Trump, right? Even if he amplified it and exacerbated it in some really awful ways. So in order to solve this problem, I think we can't think that there's only one way to do it. We need sort of a whole of society approach. So I think as it relates first to individuals, we all need to speak out when we see hate happen. The best way to end intolerance is to interrupt it. And so that means not just when I as a Jewish person see anti-Semitism, but when I as a Jewish person see anti-AAPI racism, I'm obligated to speak out, right? My moral code obligates it. And so being an upstander, not a bystander, interjecting, whether it's on someone's, on their Facebook wall or at the water cooler or, in the really at the Thanksgiving dinner or in the classroom at school, I think we all need to have the courage and the strength to speak out when hate happens at the individual level, right?
I'm curious, Jonathan, there have been studies that look at when you play or publicize these types of incidents, that sometimes it results in copycats.
Yeah, this is part of the challenge that we have is when something happens, how do we contextualize it appropriately rather than just elevating it? So whereas individuals have a role, to your point, the media, we need to tell these stories, but to contextualize them appropriately so we don't glorify them, or as you said, encourage copycats. That's not an easy thing to do. So I think at the individual level, we have responsibility. At the media level, there's a way to tell these stories responsibly. I will say it's not just broadcast media, as you were alluding to, social media has responsibility. And Derrick and I have worked hand in hand to try to hold Facebook accountable, because Facebook is really the front line today in fighting hate. The ADL does annual studies of online hate and harassment, and we find that some 40% of online users have been harassed, but we saw a huge spike in 2020 of harassment directed at Asian Americans online. Literally, it went up like 59% year over year. And indeed, Facebook is a place where it happens most prominently. So we need the social media companies to enforce their terms and to literally block the bigots and take that fringe, if you will, and put it back on the fringe. The last thing I'll just say is policymakers also have a role. So if individuals and business policymakers have a role as well, I think the best antidote to intolerance is education. So it starts with educating, again, people in positions of authority, the law enforcement, et cetera, so they understand what's a hate crime and can deal effectively. But we also need to inoculate our children from the virus of hate. So anti-bias education in schools, We've seen the data, it works. More of it at scale would, again, I think, vaccinate the next generation from this virus, and we'd all benefit from that.
Right, and I think it's worth noting that Holocaust Remembrance Day was just this past week, and the studies that show the percentage of school children who don't know enough about the Holocaust are really staggering. But that's a prime example.
I'll just say it is alarming, and make no mistake, it starts with words. It starts with words. And when people in positions of authorities call it, the Chinese virus or whatnot, we have something called the pyramid of hate at ADL that looks at how hate can escalate if you don't dial it down. And I'm glad you raised that, Juju. We all need to be educated so that we can prevent the repeat things from happening again.
Grace, I want to bring you in again on this idea of othering of Asian Americans. You've been so eloquent about how people see an Asian American face and they assume you're a foreigner. And Olivia Munn told me that she felt her mother, who was a Vietnam War refugee, just got used to being treated like a second-class citizen. And so I wonder if you can speak for a moment on this idea of the invisibility of Asian Americans, that you're from Queens, where there are so many hardworking recent immigrant Asian Americans from all over the continent and subcontinent of Asia. And how in many ways the model minority myth, and that's one of the questions in our Q&A, contributes to this rendering invisible those in our community who are struggling or who don't fit this sort of crazy rich Asians false stereotype. And why is that damaging? Because often people don't really fully understand that.
Yeah, it's so true. Look, I was born and raised in Queens, New York, which is a very diverse county. But I'm sure many other Asian Americans in New York City have grown up accustomed to racial slurs, jokes that were just jokes, and, things being said, whether it's making fun of our eyes, our food being made fun of, compliments on how well we speak English, being told to constantly go back to wherever. And a lot of that oftentimes is Asians are either seen as invisible or they are seen as foreigners and outsiders. And what happens as we talk about lack of education, lack of data, lack of evidence, is that people are left to these model minority stereotypes. And, I do want to sort of jump back a little bit to what we were talking about in terms of solidarity with other communities and how we can help each other. Because I think that as we've seen in places like Georgia, as you've seen in places like Texas, and I've spent quite a bit of time in the past few years in both of those counties, Fulton, DeKalb, Harris County in Texas. And what we have seen is that our Asian American community is often viewed as invisible. We are really taught to sort of mind our own business and not rock the boat. And whether it's in times of, getting out the vote to speaking up against hate, I've literally had so many Asian Americans ask me, I don't know what to do. I literally don't know what to say when someone says something to me. I don't know how to advocate for myself. And I want to again raise the importance of allyship and solidarity, because in both of those places, in Georgia and in Texas, the Asian American community was relatively small, quick growing, but small. It was, for example, the Black community in Georgia who held the Asian American community hand in hand and taught them and worked with them. I remember going down to visit a church program where Black churches worked with Korean churches. They created a Korean Get Out the Vote program, Souls to the Polls, but SEOULS. Loved it. During the Stacey Abrams governor election, Stacey's team tripled the Asian American turnout. In Harris County, in areas like Texas, I have seen the Latino community work hand in hand with the Asian American community, helping us to more strongly develop our vocabulary and our muscle of advocacy, because it's not something that comes very easy for us. And so as we talk about the importance of not being invisible and learning our history, we have to also work with other communities so that we can strengthen the effectiveness of our advocacy. And I also want to say something that, again, is not popular. We can't just talk to allies. We can't just talk about the racism that is hurled at our community. We have to address the racism that may exist within our own communities. And that is probably one of the most challenging issues that I have these days. Talking to media, maybe talking to ethnic media, and I've had some conversations because I showed them some headlines from various days. I said, when the attacker is white, you don't mention their race. But when the attacker is Black or Latino, you always include the race in the headline, multiple times in the body. And so what good does it do to point fingers at each other? I don't even want to say a congressperson, I, as an Asian American, am not going to allow that. I'm not going to allow any community to point fingers at another community. It is not constructive, and it's not always based on facts. And so I think that it's important that we are finding space to have these difficult conversations within our own communities as well.
1,000%. I will double down on everything that the Congresswoman just said. It speaks to what Jonathan was referring to earlier about contextualizing these reports. And I have a real fear about the viral quality of some of them. But Derrick, let me bring you in on this conversation of allyship. It was so great what you said about, be a friend before you need a friend, right? And this idea that, listen, I am old enough to have covered the uprising in LA after the Rodney King verdict. And I was sent to, Korean shops in New York with an African-American correspondent and a Korean-American producer. You could imagine the conversations that we had. And I have covered Asian-American community groups and African-American community groups building bridges between our communities for decades, only to see so many of these feelings that Grace is referring to rear their ugly heads. And so, Derrick, I wonder your thoughts on this, especially in light of the fact that, it's so easy to fall into these, tropes.
I can recall Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi, and the hurricane actually hit the Mississippi Gulf Coast, but the residual flooding impacted New Orleans. But there's a peninsula in East Biloxi, and on that peninsula is about a third African American, a third Vietnamese, and a third working poor whites. And that peninsula was completely left out of the recovery for about 5 days. The hurricane hit on a Monday. We showed up NAACP on a Saturday, and we were the first relief team there with water and tarp and food. And you could see that community organizing through allyship, that race no longer mattered. They were working together to survive. Majority of the people who remained on the peninsula were senior citizens of all three communities. They gathered at a Black Baptist church. They set up food distribution process. They salvaged their whatever salvage they had to bring it to one place. When we got there, you could see them rush to the truck to get the goods, the water, the blue tarps. Allyship is important. And that example has always stuck with me, because in reality, in this democracy, we're starving for equity. We're starving for opportunity. We're starving for fairness. And what's in front of us is white supremacist behavior that we must join together to knock out, so that we can all truly benefit for what the promise this nation has to offer. And I love what the Congresswoman mentioned. We cannot allow inter or intra conflict to distract us from the main thing that's taking place. And it's something that has pestered this country for years. Race is a social construct, and it is based on which groups will be allowed to be, quote, white. The Jewish community was not considered white until it became politically necessary for them to become white in certain geographies. The Irish community was not considered white until it became necessary politically for them to become white. The Asian community in San Francisco was maligned and locked out until it became necessary. They said, wait a minute, we got to include the Asian community. And wow, The Asian community is made up of many communities, not one community. It is the Japanese community and the Korean community and the Vietnamese community and the Chinese community. It is all of us. And so as I use that example about East Biloxi, we must continue to strive towards making sure we have the abundance that's important and not allow the scarcity mentality to cause us to fight against each other. Allyship is critical to make democracy work.
You're also eloquent. Ambassador Locke, I saw you trying to get in. I'm going to let you speak your piece, but also have you each maybe come up with some closing thoughts and emphasizing action points that people who are obviously logging on because they want to do something might be able to do, and also perhaps glimmers of hope in all of this. So Gary, let me begin with you.
Well, I just want to follow up on what Congressman Meng and Derrick just had to say. This myth of the model minority is in many ways used to try to divide ethnic groups and to almost exacerbate some of the racial bigotry and stereotypes within the Asian American community toward other ethnic groups, saying that we are the, and if we buy into this myth of the model minority, it's used by us or used by others to make us not stand up for the rights of other ethnic groups, especially African Americans and other people of color. That if we're somehow so successful, why can't others be like us? And that causes division. And you're seeing it with respect to the response by some members of the AAPI community on policies like affirmative action, whether it's Harvard, Yale, or other schools, or even New York City. And we have to be very, very careful that that myth of the model minority is really being used to divide and to separate AAPIs from other ethnic groups and to almost keep us silent. And that's why it's so gratifying to see not only the allyship of many other civil rights groups and people of color from Latinx communities and African American communities and civil rights organizations like the ADL rallying to our grievances and to the violence against us and the discrimination against AAPIs and Chinese Americans. And that's why we as Asian Americans need to be mindful that we have not made it, as all these recent events, from words to government policies to the violence against the AAPI community have demonstrated, that we have not arrived, and that freedom, equality is a constant struggle, requires constant vigilance, which means we need to always be mindful of the history of discrimination and racism within this country and bigotry, starting, from the days of the founding of our country.
We have 4 minutes left. It's such a fruitful conversation, but we're just getting flooded with questions. So I'm going to tick a few off and again, ask you to summarize, guys, with closing thoughts. One person asked about the polarization in DC, how that might impact steps moving forward. What do you say to children in the AAPI community, especially when they're about to head back to school and don't feel safe? And what about a college student who's asking about fighting hate as a career? So those are all fascinating thoughts. Jonathan, let's go to you next.
I'll say two quick things. Number one, especially that college student, if you're interested in fighting hate as a career, go to www.adl.org. I've got 25 offices and lots of openings. So we're always looking for talent. I'm going to tell you that right now. And a lot of the people work at ADL. You don't need to be Jewish. We had a great
your backdrop too. Always topping it up.
Yep. And I just want to say something else too, particularly the audience who's out here of Chinese Americans who are watching. It is wrong to suggest that somehow Chinese Americans aren't loyal to our country. And I know that as a Jewish American, and we face that same charge. It is wrong to hold Chinese Americans accountable for what happens in China, like it's wrong to do the same to Jewish Americans that happens in Israel. We are all Americans and in this together. And the model minority myth, we get it too. We all need to be recognized on our merits for what we accomplish. And we all need to realize by locking arms, we are so much stronger. And this threat of white supremacy, as Derrick has outlined it, it is insidious, it is real, and it's a threat to all of us. So again, I think with gratitude and humility, we will keep pushing and pressing, defending our AAPI brothers and sisters, and pushing for like the more perfect union that we all need.
Derrick, the actor Daniel Day-Kim said, he was encouraged by the fact that when he took to the streets to protest for BLM and against George Floyd's killing, that he saw more Asian Americans out on the streets than he had ever seen. And that those were perhaps the young Asian Americans who are finding their voices in this current call for racial solidarity. Add that to the list of 7 things I just asked you as you close out your thoughts.
Yeah, we are at an inflection point. The reason why we've seen such a rise in the visceral hate against all of our communities, and right now the Asian community and Chinese community specifically, is because we are succeeding of making this democracy work. And people are in fear of that. They're in fear of it because they're saying, what does it mean to me? How will I be placed? And our goal is to stand in solidarity. What we witnessed last summer looked like America, who took to the streets to march on the value proposition that Black Lives Matter, not that only Black Lives Matter, but until we ensure that this group, African Americans' lives matter, Asian American lives will matter, the Jewish community lives will matter, because the same forces that are operating under white supremacist dogma are seeking to attack all of us. But those demonstrations show that we're at an inflection point, that the crowd, they were Black, they were Asian, they were white, they were male, they were female, they had sexual orientations, that it was all of us. It looked like America. If we continue to march together, we will overcome this moment of intolerance and really make this country what it should be.
Grace, I'm going to let you have the last words. There's so much to say, and I'll just let you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. First of all, to each and every person who is here today watching, thank you. Thank you for taking the time. To people who are not Asian American, I want to say thank you, especially because never in my life, as someone who was born and raised in America, have I seen such a tremendous and widespread showing of support and love from people who don't look like me, from people who might not share the same Asian American background as me. So many of us have felt invisible our entire lives as Asian Americans. We have been invisible in the history books. We have been invisible in budget books. And we are, like Ambassador Locke said, at a galvanizing moment where we have to take advantage of this. And what can we do, especially us who are children of immigrants, whose parents sacrificed so much so that we could have equal opportunity, opportunities that they might have missed because they gave up their adulthood in many ways. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to take on the responsibility and the obligation to create spaces like this to have important conversations. Even as we're talking about Black Lives Matter movement, I've had local leaders ask me, were there Asians at Black Lives Matter protests? Because they weren't necessarily aware of these movements and these activities that their own children and peers might have been at. So we have to make sure, like Jonathan said, that we are contextualizing these stories. And we cannot let groups be pitted against each other. That is not going to solve anything. I am here for you. I've participated, as many of my fellow panelists have, on so many Zooms, so many events. We have young people who are finding ways from different communities to establish and to forge partnerships, to work together, sometimes for the very first time. So if the kids can do it, we can all do it. So I just really want to say thank you. We have a long road ahead of us, but I am very hopeful.
Thank you all so much, Derrick and Jonathan, for your life work and the organizations that you so boldly lead, to Grace and to Senator Padilla, who are working in the halls of Congress, and to Gary Locke, whose leadership here at C100 made tonight possible. Gary, final thoughts and gratitude.
We need to be proud of our ancestry. We need to be proud of our diversity. We need to tell our story, and we need to be letting people know that we are all Americans. We're not foreigners, we're Americans. and our ancestors have given their blood, sweat, and tears for this country. We need to stand up united, proudly, and join forces and speak out against racism and bigotry and stereotypes, even like, as others said, at the water cooler, Thanksgiving table, because that's part of the educational process. So be proud. We are a country of diversity, and that's what we need to celebrate.
So well said, all of you, thank you. And for those of you out there watching, feel free to reach out to any of the organizations that were part of the discussion or were even referred to in this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.